So
Excellent.
we'll give people a couple of extra minutes because we changed the link and
Sure.
screwed everybody up. So,
That's all right.
how's it going, everybody? How's everybody's week been?
Good. I leave to Vegas tomorrow.
Nice.
Not bad.
Pretty good.
Cool. So let's get started. And we'll do a kind of soft start for a couple of minutes and let people join. But so everybody, this is Kreigh. You read his bio. He's a very, very cool guy. He's a bit of an expert in critical thinking and tutoring the 1%. Which is an excellent book title. And so he's going to talk to us today about all kinds of really cool things, mostly focused around critical thinking and education. But I'll let him do a better introduction to himself. So why don't we go around? We'll do kind of Matt, Jared, Bradley, Danielle, Cindy, Christian. Do your 30-second intro, who you are, what school you go to, what you're interested in education. Just, go for it. Matthew.
Yes, my name is Matt. I think we've met before. I go to Minerva along with two other people here, and my interest in education kind of lies within challenging the common tropes and expectations that normally underlie the way we design education.
Hey, I'm Jared. I'm currently on a leave of absence from college, most likely going to not be returning. I'm working as a software developer for an education technology nonprofit backed by the Gates Foundation and Google.org and a few others. And basically my life mission is to foster a human capital revolution through education technology.
My name's Bradley. I go to City College of San Francisco. I'm getting ready to transfer. And I enjoy, in terms of education, is innovation through disrupting processes and just reanalyzing them and try to remake them.
I'm Danielle. I'm graduating in entrepreneurship this spring, and I want to look at education through a business lens. I'm interested in learning analytics. Those two are together, learning analytics, like one thing. And yeah.
I'm Cindy. I would go to Minerva schools, and I'm interested in social entrepreneurship and using that as a tool to empower the lower 40% of people who don't even have access to education, and to scale solutions to people who don't necessarily have the means to access current solutions available. And that's sort of my mission that I'm going to be developing throughout my entire lifetime. And all the things I do are centered around that and changing how success is perceived in this world.
Very cool.
I'm Christian. I'm right now calling from France, where I go to school to Sciences Po, studying political science and economics. And I went to a United World College, which like a different approach to education, also combining, and ever since I learned about it, then I went to Senegal, taught there English and math in middle school, and that kind of gave me kind of like an objective to get more involved into like the global challenge of like global education and how we can improve that around the world, and then maybe also like connect our educational systems around the globe.
Very cool. All right. Is that everyone?
I think that's everyone, unless Ali is able to speak from behind her camera. Nope. Okay, that's fine. Oh yeah, maybe.
All right.
Maybe.
Okay, I am in
Oh, there we
somewhat
go.
of a quiet spot, and I'm gonna have to check out of the meeting at 6:30. But I am another one of the student leaders, and excited to hear from you, especially since you joined in on such short notice. So thank you for that. And yeah, I guess we'll just get started.
All right. You're gonna miss the fun because the Q&A I think is where things are gonna get real.
I will watch it for sure later. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get rolling then. So you may want to let me just see. There we go. Today's lecture is going to be a little bit quirky, and we'll start off with some educational questions, and then I'm going to get into some background, and then we'll kind of come back to those questions more in the discussion. But I'm particularly excited to talk with you guys today because we're going to explore something known as the dialectical shift, which is a fun little thing actually in critical thinking that simply means that we're going to shift from one sort of dialogue to another. We might just stick in one, but we'll likely end up pivoting. And normally that shift is known as a fallacy. And so it'd be if you go from an information-seeking dialogue, which is what we have now, basically me presenting to you, and then you asking questions of me to further suss things out. But we may end up later on, and some of this is intentional, just in how your whole process is designed, to go to what are known as persuasion and deliberation dialogues. And we may even do a hybrid of those. And those are kind of a persuasion is basically someone will have a viewpoint and they'll try to convince someone of their viewpoint and back and forth. But deliberation is a little bit more fun, and that's where you're really trying to say something's unsettled and where do we go from here? And I think I will leave you partly with that tonight, but we will see. And that's intentional so that your conversations continue beyond just listening to me this evening. So anyway, it's kind of an oddity and a rarity that we actually get to do a non-fallacious use of this dialectical shift. So it's kind of fun for a critical thinking person, or particularly someone who in argumentation theory, which is my own area of research, it's really, really fun to do and kind of exciting to explore. So I'm going to list some things that, while they're completely germane to the realm of critical thinking, are not necessarily terms or concepts that you will spend every minute thinking about. I'll be going over the background and some normative rules and elements of those for discussions. And I'm willing to bet that most of you aren't familiar with at least parts of them. And so I'm listing them in part because we're exploring critical thinking, and those are elements that are within the realm, and it'll kind of offer both a meta commentary and an anchor point from which we can kind of proceed with our further conversation. So with all that said, I do recommend taking some screenshots perhaps as we go. And I saw that at least one of you is on your iPhone. I apologize. Some of the font's going to be pretty tiny. Fortunately, you'll be able to look this over later and go from there. And the reason it's tiny is I didn't want to have 800 of these to go through. But I'll go through a pretty fast clip through a couple of them, and knowing that at least one of you is on an iPhone, actually two of you I think, I will read off the key bit, and then the rest of it you can look over later when you're at a laptop. All right, so with no further ado, let me share.
While Kreigh is just sharing his screen, so remember that if you have a question, just put your hand in front of the camera. If Kreigh can't see you while he's speaking, doing the presentation, then just wait for like a respectful moment to interrupt and be like, "Excuse me, I have a question." Just unmute yourself and speak. That's totally fine.
Yep, and the first couple slides I'll go through swiftly, and then we'll slow down a bit as it gets going. All right, I say I'll go swiftly, but I may be a little bit slow, but I'll do my best to be done by 8:40 at the latest so that we can actually get into the good stuff, which is the Q&A portion. All righty, so share screen, and here we go. All right, is everyone good? You can all see it? Someone can unmute for a second since I can't see you. Are you guys good?
I'm not sure that we can see it.
Right, let me click on it again. And then here we go. All right. Are you able to see now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Everyone can see, yeah? Unmute and say no if you can't see. Perfection.
All right, there we go. Glad I asked before I started rolling. So, although now it looks like I actually can see you. It's popping up, which means I won't be able to read things all the way. Glorious. So I tell critical thinking and thinkers in education, as that is what you guys are described as, all kinds of fun. And this is going to kind of take us through background, but also to say what is thinking about education. So I'm going to start off with two questions. And these two questions are not obviously the only questions that we can address. And these aren't actually ones that the next few slides are going to directly address. They're going to implicitly address them and give us a direct context by which to approach them. But it's really, I mean, what is thinking about education in a sense, and then also within it. Those are two very different questions, occasionally confused, but important, and to some people vital, actually, to how we think about K-12 education and then as well higher education, which it looks like this group is exploring both of those ideas. All right, moving into the fun parts. So here are just the dialogues. There are a number of systems of dialogues. Different rhetorical scholars and argumentation theory scholars will list them differently. These are from Douglas Walton, who is perhaps the preeminent scholar in informal logic. He's at least the most published. And you'll see his name crop up a couple times this evening. But the ones that I talked about at the beginning were, again, the information-seeking dialogue. That's the one that we're kind of going through now. And then deliberation and persuasion as potentially being ones that we might end up with in the end, one or both, or just sticking with information-seeking. And then there's some of the others. There are a number of others that you could list. At a certain point, you end up having too many dialogues to even get your brain wrapped around. I like this list. Interestingly enough, Douglas Walton seems to be changing his mind about whether scientific inquiry actually fits under this heading of inquiry. He's listed it recently as being a seventh type of dialogue, but he hasn't explored it all the way through. So I'm intrigued to kind of see what he means by that. But again, that's one he's left unexplored. It used to be at least that he put the scientific one under inquiry. All right, this is where things get insane, but this is the fun part. And so this is particular for a critical discussion or critical dialogue. This is going to be the one that falls into, just to go back for a second, the persuasion dialogue in a real sense, although it can have elements in the others, including information seeking. But the fun thing is, and again, as you all have, at least on the website that introduces all of you, given that you are thinkers critical, if you will, that these would be rules that people will often go with, and you'll find different formulations of these in different places. But this is one. The last part is the one that I particularly want to highlight. And so this is at the end. You can ask me clarifying questions, because I will have some questions throughout, some arguments, and I'll do my best to make certain that they're neither obscure, excessively vague, nor confusingly ambiguous. But you are welcome to ask me clarifying questions as we go through. Interestingly, in Rule 10, it's the latter part, and this is why this one is bolded. It's not bolded in his book. But it's that they must be interpreted as accurately as possible. This is something that people don't necessarily want to do, and I include people who call themselves critical thinkers. And we can get into that more later if you like. All right, moving along. We have the 5 characteristics of a credible arguer. And this is, again, one to kind of give you some ideas of bits and pieces of fun. And these, again, will be things that in your own discussions are rather valuable to think through, both in terms of, are you approaching it that way, but also as the person with whom you are communicating approaching it that way. Because then you may find yourself in a different dialogue than you expected. And interestingly enough, critical thinkers like to think, and this is how it's taught to people in a freshman introductory course, and then they never go beyond it. is simply that you're at all times in a critical discussion, and therefore everyone must be a credible arguer at all times. And yet in the real world, we will be in persuasion dialogues where it's kind of one-sided, but we'll also be in other forms of dialogue where it isn't necessarily a fallacy to not have all of these things. It might make the person unfortunate or impossible, but these are the expectations that fall within a critical discussion, which again, with the way that it's often taught in school, one would think that critical thinking means that at all times we're in a critical discussion, but that's something that both parties have to agree to, and it's sometimes helpful to know that you aren't necessarily in that sort of a dialogue. I really, really like the little thing that I put an asterisk, and this is actually after the 5 points that he has on that page. But the suspension of one's own advocacy is a really hard thing to do. That's why I highlighted that. It's, it's kind of the hardest thing to do. And again, those who like to call themselves critical thinkers don't like critical doubt, actually, not when it comes to their own assumptions. And sometimes people talk about this as bias, but everyone has biases, and sometimes they're explicit, sometimes they're implicit, what can be known as like a dark side of an argument. But critical doubt is one of these curiosities that is in fact quite difficult. Sometimes people describe it as being humility, but I find the word humility too vague. And doesn't quite get the suspension. And I like suspension of well because it goes with that suspension of disbelief that one has to have in reading certain sci-fi or watching certain movies. All right. Now we're going to get to the fun. And I'm putting a definition in place. Again, this is all background to the conversation. But the equivocation fallacy is one, and the way it's sometimes written about in, I'll actually say poorly written critical thinking textbooks, is simply that anything that is ambiguous is equivocation. And most scholars have gotten to the point now where they think that if you're just ambiguous once, it doesn't really matter. It's if you're ambiguous twice and the ambiguity, as it's described here, is such that it can go one way in the first sentence and a different way in a second sentence. And more importantly, that this fallacy can be in more of an extended argument than just the basic syllogistic form that people will often give as an example in, again, those undergraduate textbooks. So this is a really big one, actually in critical thinking. And I'm going to come back to this idea later. So, critical thinking. Is it an abstraction? And I jokingly put here the AKA engineer no-fly zone simply because engineers love abstractions in engineering and they don't love abstractions in real-world conversation, rather infrequently. This isn't universally the case. This is what's known as a defeasible argument, and in this case, a defeasible joke, presumptive defeasible, if you will. And I have noticed, and again, this is anecdotal, not a research-based thing, that engineers do love to tell you about the 7 ways that people communicate or something like that, which is often based on one psychology study and not many, but then we'll tell you that since it's science, it's a precising sort of thing, whereas it's more scientism. So I hope that you had a little bit of a chance to look at the fallacy of it. And the fallacy is that when something is an abstraction, if we describe it as a thing, a specific thing, then we're actually missing the boat. And again, an abstraction is not necessarily a definitional concept like what is a metric ton, but it's more of a generic idea and one that can be fleshed out in different ways. And so it's a fallacy if you say that something is a metric ton when it is in fact not. It is just a large amount, if you will. So, an important question, though, is whether critical thinking is an abstraction. And often when this is put in psychological terms, we actually would end up with it being an abstraction. If it's purely based in psychology, cognitive psychology, if you will. And so we have this question is, when people talk about it as well, do we use it as an abstraction even if we don't think of it as such? As you may have noted about my current book, I'm looking into how we use it in the real world, and this matters very, very much so for education. All right. This is where my research has kind of taken an interesting turn. And I should note that 7 years ago, it started with a very simple question, simply, what is critical thinking? And the more I researched, the more interesting my search got. And one of the things that I found is that we tend to, particularly in education, K-12 and in university level, have a stipulative usage of it. And you end up almost having this educational game of telephone, where I call it one thing, you call it something else. And this could be that we're simply dealing with it as an abstraction, as in the former slide. But what's fascinating is that many usages, at least again as it's used in common educational parlance, end up being stipulative. And so a question that we would have to ask ourselves is the actual usage, in a normative sense, stipulative? And does it really matter if it ends up being stipulative or not? So, are you sick of definitions yet? We got a couple more coming. All right. So this is where we get into some real fun. Is critical thinking a specific thing, or is it an abstraction? Because if it's a specific thing and not an abstraction, then our stipulative usages could end up being fallacious, and we could end up running into that fallacy of equivocation, which is a bit of a problem, particularly when we're talking about something that people will use in reference to better, cogent, closer, clearer, whatever you like sort of thinking. So some of you may recognize the first name that I have on there. And then the latter one is from a book on critical thinking. And it's interesting, abilities there could be an abstraction usage, which is actually how I read it in many instances. And in this context, it actually could go either way as to being a specific thing or an abstraction, actually. And the bit that I cut out with the ellipses there is simply where it talks about it being within the realm of informal logic. I figured you didn't need all the words in the world about that. So, as you might have noted, I had you write a few things, and they were in part to get your brains oriented to how we think about critical thinking. And then beyond that, how do we converse about it? Because how we think about it and how we converse about it are two very different things. And part of the reason I wanted the first answer in 30 to 60 seconds is I wanted your kind of gut reaction, not because it revealed anything of implicit biases or anything stupid like that, but because it actually shows how we might use it in conversation. We aren't going to necessarily sit there and reflect all the time when we're in conversation. And so how we converse about a thing sometimes ends up dictating what the thing is. And so one of the issues that I've run into is that those two questions don't necessarily produce the same answers, even from the same people. Not that that would be any surprise to a cognitive scientist, but it's still a bit of an oddity given the type of thing we're talking about. And CT there is shorthand, by the way, for critical thinking. It's a shorthand people eventually use, and I fall into that pattern. All right. One of the things that I found remarkable, and a few of your answers showed this actually, is what I like to call the critical thinking end game. And it's all over the place. That's, and I mean all over the place. Just Google it. I can show you one example later. Actually, I may have two of them even. But I've highlighted three of them, and actually the top one's my favorite because it's in this course, and I'll come come back to this one. This actually relates to business education and analytics instruction, in fact. So one of you will be particularly interested. But it says critical and analytical thinking. And I've always thought, and in fact, most people say, what is critical thinking? And they'll say, well, I guess analytical thinking, right? And so it's a curiosity that you would have critical and analytical thinking. What I love about it in the appearance in this course is that later they removed the and when they were defining it, and they called it critical analytical thinking as some sort of mutant hybrid of the things. But all of these are separable events, and yet many times these are included under the heading of critical thinking. And so we run into this issue of, are people lacking clarity of thought? With the and, are they trying to define critical thinking, even though that isn't the way in which one would normally do it? And if these are critical thinkers, as you notice I have down there, communications thinking, grammatical thinking, one would hope then that they would not need to do that, or at least be clear. My favorite is the second bolded one, the in a mindful way. And this is literally a definition from a professor at, oh my goodness, she's a business professor at Carnegie Mellon. This is one of her psychology peer-reviewed journals. And the essay is just remarkable in that earlier she defined critical thinking as mindfulness. And then later she thought that she needed to say critical thinking in a mindful way. And I thought it was curious because I was wondering if there's a mindless way of doing critical thinking, or we could be unmindful. It was a very much a curiosity for me. And further, isn't critical thinking, that being the definition and her definition, why would she then include it in a later sentence since it was already given in its definition? It's an issue of either she thought her audience was filled with idiots or something else, but I'm not entirely sure. The last one, and I love this one, and this shows up way too frequently, at least for people who care about critical thinking. Almost any definition that you would find, and it's either implicit or explicitly stated, would include formulating good questions. And yet, we have this strangeness where many times critical thinking with the and game is then said, and good questions. All right. Here's another delight. And I should be careful because I've even seen a recent essay that said that maybe we should consider the social sciences hard sciences and the hard sciences to be soft sciences, because the soft sciences are cited much more frequently in our everyday life. It's kind of a fun argument. But ignoring that one, if we go with the soft or hard, what is it as a skill? And so then we could say, is it mathematical thinking, which people will usually say is a hard skill? Or is it something more touchy-feely, like, your EQ, right? Which is one of those subjects of research that people are bickering over. But if we think of scientific thinking as hard, or statistical thinking is hard, formal logic is hard, and argumentation theory, maybe soft, rhetorical theory, soft, right? What is critical thinking? And interestingly enough, I often see it listed as a soft skill, and yet the way in which people talk about it is in reference to it as a hard skill. Now, the cognitive biases I'm just going to touch on because sometimes people like to shoehorn this into critical thinking, and I'm not going to say whether it should or should not be there. I will say that these are soft, and I say that because they go in and out of actually being biases that are acknowledged as real or not, and as being biases that are even worth reflecting upon. If you go to Wikipedia, there's like 140 of them. and not that Wikipedia is the only answer, but interestingly, cognitive biases are the ones most frequently referenced, particularly by those in startup culture. And they'll go more or less from those Wikipedia pages and then continue on. Curiously, both of the instances that I referenced earlier, the two books, I'll flip back to them. I went too far back. Neither of these, even though one of these includes a neuroscientist, actually talked much about the cognitive biases. Take that as you will. So it's an interesting one because cognitive biases are very difficult to figure out only because social science, while being science, is still necessarily undergoing changes. And so a real question actually in critical thinking is how well you can rely upon psychology-based arguments, which is kind of a fun one. All right, is someone's hand up, or I see an orange thing?
So I have screwed up a little bit, and because EdSurge wouldn't let me use the platform, I've made this meeting on my personal account, which is not a pro account. So okay. So in about 5 minutes, this meeting will run out, and we'll have to switch to a new link. And I really apologize. So I'm going to email everybody a new link, and when this meeting runs out in 7 minutes and 30 seconds, if everybody just switches to the new link, that'll be super easy. So cool. I'm very sorry about that, everybody. But I'll send you a link. Sorry.
I figure you're just cutting me off as with the timers that counted down. All right. So other fun questions, and actually this bottom one is not resolved, is whether critical thinking skills are transferable across disciplines or whether they are domain specific. And this is a fascinating question as to whether critical thinking is a thing or multiple things and what that looks like. And even if it is a thing, is it multiple things within these domains or these silos? And there's much bickering actually that goes on about this. And this bickering goes on as kind of these high-level arguments. Everyone's up here arguing about it. And people who don't hear about it, particularly, are those in the media. So when you see it presented in the media, no one talks about it, or at least rarely talks about it, as being transferable or domain specific. And the argument's a little bit ugly. I'd say the weight tends to go towards it being a transferable skill, but the argument is not settled, no matter whether you're approaching it from a social science perspective or a philosophy perspective. And it's a fun question. I guess you can ask me later what I think of it, but yeah, that one's a little tough. All right. One of the things that I've encountered is that critical thinking is only ever used in a eulogistic sense. Now, later I'll actually point out a couple of examples that are counterexamples to my thesis right here. So this isn't a universal deductive statement, if you will. It's saying on the balance. So more times than not, and in fact, if we wanted to put a statistical number on it, which I wouldn't because I think it would be difficult to do that, but at least 95% of the time, it's in a positive sense. And it very likely is higher than that. 99 would be a safe estimate. And so an interesting thing, at least to me, is why is this? Why don't we just say good thinking? And in fact, many books that are cited in critical thinking or informal logic are good thinking. Those are the old titles. And even actually a recent book is titled that. And then he gets in to say that he's talking about critical thinking. He just titled his book as Good Thinking instead. Even earlier in the 20th century, they'd call it right thinking. And actually one of the really early figures, Isaac Watts, talked about it as like the right use of practical reason as part of the subtitle of his book. And that book, by the way, don't bother reading. It's boring as anything. It was one of the ones that I stumbled across and then later found out that it's like a prominent book in the history of. So kudos to me for actually being on top of things, but it's awful. What, though, would that look like, and why have we chosen the word critical thinking? Now, we're going to get into this. And the right thinking, that was gotten rid of for a number of reasons. Obviously, postmodernity is the one reference people like to make, and that certainly fits. It was also kind of attached almost essentially to formal logic, and formal logic is not the only thing talked about in philosophy anymore, and its luster kind of waned as basically past the 1960s for a lot of reasons, namely that it failed to save the world from all sorts of ill, and it didn't produce a universal grammar, which they had assumed that it will. And then system 2 thinking would obviously be the Kahneman reference. So Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's famous from the 70s on, very heavily published in cognitive psychology. Brilliant guy, does some great research, did a lot of research into what makes someone successful. And sometimes it's actually just calling them successful, which is kind of interesting. Actually showed as well that experts tend to not think even within their expertise, unless they're reminded that they're operating their expertise. And the particular instance that he chose, so this is again a defeasible thing because he chose one instance and then you're saying it's analogous to other situations, is that it was with statisticians, and statisticians don't think in terms of statistics if they're just presented with an everyday problem off the cuff, which is remarkable. And again, you could say that it's Kahneman's idea of system 1 thinking, which is your gut, and then system 2, which is reflection. But it's interesting to note that experts have to be aware that they're using their expertise, or they might, in fact, not. So there you go. So we could say system 2 thinking, and that was actually one of the definitions, or emerged in one of the definitions that you all gave me, which was quite fun to see. All right. Let me see. Do we want to do this next slide? All right. I'd say maybe let's switch over. Is it okay if we switch over now, Rosie?
Yeah, that's perfect. Sorry about that, guys. I
For the
sent
next
you all
slide.
an email. Just jump into the new meeting. See you in a second.
All right.
Hey, guys. Welcome back.
Kreigh, you're muted.
Kreigh, if you're speaking, you're muted. If you just press unmute, then there we go.
There we go. I bumped it accidentally. My apologies. All right. So let's... Oh, apparently I have my slide up twice. Let me fix that. Okay, there we go. Let me share screen. All right, so everyone should be able to see me. There we go. And it restarted me, so hopefully none of you are going nuts with me going that fast. Okay, so this is where the fun kind of hits, at least for me. I imagine a number of you thought that critical thinking is like this all-time thing that has been in existence since the dawn of time, and Socrates talked about it, lectured on it, yada, yada, yada. In fact, the phrase itself really comes into, it's used a little bit before, but in terms of it being a term that people think about and defined, and then actually one that influences education and philosophy is John Dewey. I believe at this time he was at University of Chicago. If not, that's kind of where he made his mark. He actually influenced one of my favorite authors, and E.A. Burt, who wrote The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Physical Science, and actually wrote a book titled Right Thinking. That was part of the title of it, amusingly enough. Again, pre-1950, that you could use the idea of right thinking. And so this is kind of the thing, is that critical thinking is perhaps just a term that people are using to replace some of these older terms. But John Dewey is really the bigwig here. And John Dewey was critiqued and remains critiqued for being someone who always sounds on the verge of saying something profound, but never quite getting there. And I'd actually agree with that critique. He sounds amazing, but if you really start analyzing everything that he says, he doesn't always reach a conclusion, and it just sounds, the profundity is there as long as you spend enough time adding it yourself. Otherwise, the words just sound excellent. So with that said, though, he comes up with a definition and we got a comment. Is that a, hold on. It appeared there and then disappeared. Does someone need to interrupt me there?
No, sorry, that was just me agreeing with you that John Dewey is perfect.
No worries. We have this idea, though, of suspended judgment. And actually, if you look at that, that sounds very similar to some of the definitions that you all gave me. Well, not all of them. Many of them were like, we got the thing and then we thought about it more. But I'm okay with, we could, if I were to read your definitions kindly, which is the disposition of reading someone else's thoughts in the best way possible, isn't necessarily interwoven in the definition of critical thinking. That's a dispositional thing, and people will talk about it that way, and they'll make an ethical claim, and many philosophers and psychologists do, but it isn't necessarily there. It's actually one of the quirks, and one of the elements of fun. But nevertheless, my own approach, whether I think it's embedded in critical thinking or not, is to read things charitably as often as I can. And I think suspended judgment was at least implicit in many of your definitions. But it isn't until the 70s that this stuff starts to emerge. And part of this is that people were not enjoying how formal logic was taught. And basically, the fallacy police would emerge, and they would just always shout, fallacy, fallacy, and they were talking about formal fallacies in like really long conversations where they didn't really apply, and it was just kind of unnecessary. And also, it just didn't really handle real-world arguments. And so I say informal logic to rebirth, but you could really almost say it's birth, because informal logic doesn't appear until the 70s. That term is in response to it being a little bit softer than formal logic. And so actually these two almost come as twin spires. Many times when people think of critical thinking, they think of informal logic, and this is in part because they emerge at the same time. But informal logic is really more of a philosophical thought and errand, whereas critical thinking comes out, yes, of philosophy, but it's also education. And then, of course, educational philosophy. And that's because Dewey, by about the 50s, really started to influence education. And that had gained a lot of momentum by the 70s. Again, he kind of came to prominence in the 30s, and then teachers started getting trained by him. And so by the 50s and then the 60s, you start getting more of these teachers. And so by the 70s, you really have the moment for the critical thinking movement to emerge. So by the late 80s and even after, critical thinking is pretty much everywhere. And people are using it instead of logic and good thinking and others, although again, those can still appear. And so sometimes people if they don't think that critical thinking is an old thing, they treat it like it's a new thing, like it just emerged, and that's just historically inaccurate. And actually, many people who write about critical thinking and profess expertise in that realm have little historical idea of it, which is not necessarily the worst thing ever, but when they make reference to a history of ideas and they ignore that fact, then it becomes one. So now in the 21st century, we have it as both a 21st century skill and a big idea, and I need to pick up my pace here as we get time for talking, which means we're back to it being a thing and it being an abstraction. Oh, fun. So I'm just going to quickly blitz through this one, and I'm only going to note, and again, you can look this over later, we got the critical thinking and, although it never includes informal logic. So this is a course that actually is defined. It's evidence-based management. You can look it up. It's through edX, but it's from Australian National University. It counts as 1/4 of their MBA program if you complete it, within like a calendar year. And so I've been going through it, and weirdly enough, they define evidence 6 ways, critical thinking not at all. And when they talk about critical thinking, it's always in reference to cognitive psychology or some other form of the social sciences, like human resources, things like that. And weirdly, it never talks about informal logic, even though it's kind of making reference to it. And so they talk about evidence, and they say evidence is all the things, but actually it's only social science. Even though they have define it 6 ways, as they talk about it, the way it's used throughout the course, they do not reference philosophy rhetoric at all, which, given critical thinking's origin, interesting. Is it a shift in how we think about critical thinking? Is it just their shift? And then this is where things become interesting, and we go from the realm of critical thinking, and we go from the realm of evidence to the realm of scientism, which is this realm where science is everything, science is the sum total of life. And they run into a huge issue by ignoring informal logic because, and I think they, usually it's Bayesian thinking, but this is a copy and paste directly from their site, which again, they were putting it together swiftly. So they call it Bayesian thinking, and maybe they've used it to designate it from the actual mathematical thinking. But what's weird is they say, hey, Bayesian thinking is when you don't know the actual probability of something, you can kind of add stats to it and go from there. What they say is, hey, you don't actually need to know the mathematical formula. They literally say this. You don't need to know the math. And you don't need to know anything except this, that it's a way of reevaluating how you think about stuff. And then as you gain more information, you kind of increase the probability or the plausibility of an event happening or an outcome or that sort of thing, which is cool and all, except what they've done is they've given something that's non-mathematical. Again, you aren't using the formula, you aren't putting numbers with it, you have no way of calculating stats, and they've given it a mathematical name, which is a bit of an issue. And the fun thing is that informal logic, and I've used this term earlier, there are presumptive to feasible arguments, which means you don't actually know the probability, but you can say you can give it degrees of plausibility. It seems like a strong argument, it seems like a weak argument. I can't declare anything for certain, but I've got either or. And so you can increase, it goes from strong to weak, right? And so this is a weaker argument, this is just kind of weak, seems like an okay argument, stronger, 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 right? Which is cleaner than giving it a mathematical name when you don't have mathematical certainty. If you want to talk cognitive biases, and they do, their whole thing is basically based in cognitive psychology, anchoring it in mathematics when it isn't mathematical is worrisome. And then you get another and there at the bottom. All right. This isn't something that I'm arguing. You can come back to this later. But we can run into some issues in how we talk about it. And I'll go here and then I'll continue on, which will come back to that prior slide. If we did a poll, I'm willing to bet that most of you that have encountered critical thinking have not encountered any of those or at least few of those, I know Matt has encountered them, but I'm willing to bet the rest of you have not really encountered this idea of argumentation theory or those definitions, even though those are in the mainstream of informal logic. I put those there in part to anchor our conversation, but also to show you when you come into education for critical thinking or education of critical thinking, depending on who it's taught by, you might not even run into many of the things in informal logic, even though you're taught the informal logic principles. So, here are my arguments or observations. And the second really is, if we're going between critical thinking being an abstraction or it being a thing, and even being a thing, what sort of stipulative definition we put on it, we haven't actually used critical thinking very well. And in that case, we actually have the fallacy of equivocation fully in play. And when we want to converse about an education, we end up talking past each other. We might both agree, yeah, critical thinking is a great thing, and be talking, one of us about mathematical thinking, and the other one about plausible arguments. Or about something from alternative dispute resolution. And I have a little side note, and this is one that I don't support in here, but I will say that the best writing and reasoning and speaking that I've seen on critical thinking is when the authors take critical thinking and give it a stipulative definition and then actually go talk about the thing they really wanted to talk about. A great book in business writing is The Halo Effect. And aside from its comments on critical thinking, once it gets going, it's fantastic when it stops talking about critical thinking. All right, so I'm just going to give you these, and actually many of the books that I just talked about in critical thinking won't even give you these questions, which are basically very simple ones. They'll simply give you one or two things, and these are from argumentation theory, but quite useful, whether you're in argumentation theory or, in fact, any realm of talking to someone who claims expertise. And I'm giving them to you because now you guys get to ask me questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and let's get into the conversation now that I've used up way more time than I intended to.
Okay,
all right, so hit stop share. That doesn't, there we go, perfect. All right, so sorry for going too long.
Hello, can you hear me, or am I muted still?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. So just some things as you were going through, it seems like critical thinking is very soft in the sense that there's not an absolute agreed upon definition, so it has to be flexible and fluid at some point. And one way I've analyzed it, like I feel like critical thinking is, I use my memory of things that I know and I apply that to whatever subject or whatever I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So if I look at that red hexagonal thing at the end of the hill and it says stop on it, I know that says stop sign. If I critically analyze that, I've learned that before, right? Mm-hmm. But on a more complex problem, I could probably break it down and I add weight to what I think the solution is. But something that kind of came up as you were talking about it, that's kind of how I've always thought about it. But thinking is something that's very relative to everyone. So everyone, the process in which they think, the process in which they come to answers is completely different, right? So critical thinking itself may be a myth, because how are we to say that someone's thought process isn't critical or is critical when they all take different ways to get to something? And that's kind of where I ended at, and I would let you kind of go off from that.
Yeah. So where critical thinkings, and so this, I'm going to talk about it from the general realm, not my own perspective, but to give you, because I think that's what you're asking for. The way critical thinking is defined is basically going to be using the informal and formal fallacies, so flaws of reasoning that aren't based in the subjectivity of cognitive psychology. So this is actually when many cognitive psychologists talk about it and just go on cognitive biases, they run into this realm of full-out relativism where it is relative to the individual. And aspects of it are. And so that's the thing, is like reasoning the best answer, the stop sign, is very much an aspect of critical thinking. And some people, the second definition that I gave earlier, that author would very much articulate that it's a broad spectrum beyond just argumentation. The narrow definition and initial definition is that of just evaluating arguments, specific arguments that you encounter in the real world, say if you're reading a newspaper, or a scientist making argument. Yeah.
So just any evaluation of any argument whatsoever would be.
That's the narrowest definition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on the relationship between heuristics and critical thinking? Do you think more so that critical thinking is a heuristic, or that it employs the heuristics, or that they are completely differentiable or one and the same?
Yeah, so heuristic, this is a fun one. And one of the people only made it as a footnote. So George Polya, who's a mathematical, he was both a teacher and actually someone who did original research, which is rare. And he wrote the seminal book, How to Solve It, which is just fantastic. And he talks actually about how, in a number of aspects, but in part, how you can use reasoning the best answer, or saying, I don't know, but I'm going to make a plausible assumption, work on it, and then maybe I'll find better grounding. And that sort of heuristic, critical thinking scholarship usually doesn't even acknowledge him, weirdly enough. In terms of whether it is a heuristic, that's actually the debate, whether it is itself or whether it's a flitting between heuristics. And so a heuristic, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a way of reasoning in a particular environment, a way of kind of getting, so if you're, the driving the car example was one thing, so you might have a checklist of driving in the UK versus in America, and so then you kind of change things as to which side of the road you should drive on. And again, you have to go from background knowledge then, and you make plausible assumptions. But it can go into even specific disciplines. And so the question, that actually is the question with critical thinking, is it domain specific, in which case I don't know how it's separable from a heuristic, or is it the ring, the one ring to rule them all? And that's the way it's often talked about, and although not universally, but yeah, it's in, and then it's, or is it just like the soft skill, and it's the soft skills, all the heuristics, but empathy, which is separate from it, but somehow intertwined with it, is like its own heuristic. And so that's a tough question. I won't have a definitive answer. I've thought through it myself. The way that I would put it is, in its best light, critical thinking does deal with heuristics. But that's my own thoughts on it. That's not actually I don't even say the majority opinion would agree with that statement. Yeah.
Do we have time for another question?
I'm good. I'm good for as long as you guys want to ask me questions. I know that you guys might have to leave. So
cool. So if you have to leave right now, then just remember that we need you to send that application link for the summer cohort to anyone that you know that's really cool. Spread the word. Summer is going to be great. We're going to be running it even better than this semester. Each semester is better than the last. So send that link. If you don't have to go right now, we're going to keep going for another kind of 5 or 10 minutes. So yeah, hang around if you want to. Next question.
Okay, so if it is the one ring to rule them all, as you just nicely put it, if it is something that could improve how we perform on a whole range of topics, right, a process, how would you propose we start introducing using it more in the context of education?
Okay, so are you asking, it's a great question. Are you asking K-12 or are you asking higher ed? Because those are slightly different in how I would answer them. Yeah.
I think our main focus is supposed to be higher ed, so we could probably start there.
Okay. Well, when I first, so about a year into my research, my next argument that I was intending to make was that what we really need to do, and this was before I knew about its history really, was what we really need to do is get back to the old standard, which would be like 30 or 40 years old, of teaching formal logic and informal logic. And often what I see happen in formal logic courses, ones that I've taken, ones that I've looked at that are put on online, they're from universities and they just put them on for various things, whether it's Apple or elsewhere, is they talk about critical thinking, and what they do is they put out like a list of 10 questions and say, hey, we're going to teach critical thinking. And then they get into formal logic after putting out this list of questions. And so in order to handle it well, what happens is, well, twofold. First, we need to throw out the crappy tests that we have that evaluate critical thinking. I'll tell you what I think of the tests in higher ed. They're garbage. And they're garbage because they switch from asking people to make deductive inferences to inductive inferences. And what happens is they don't actually, you can be in a situation where by using your own reasoning, you would come up with scenarios where the deductive scenario that they presented isn't deductive. And because it's a multiple choice test, you're stuck with it. The other test, so that's the California based one. What's it? I can't remember. Inspired measurement or something stupid like that's their name now. A number of you would be familiar with that test. I'm pretty sure they use it at Minerva. Good luck to you guys on that. The other one is, I think they're the ones that their website's criticalthinking.org, and they include essay-based, which is actually more related to what people would think, but even theirs. So one of the majors I had in undergrad was music, and I was actually music performance. And so they have this whole thing about, oh, here's how to evaluate critical thinking in music, and their whole prompt is absurd. So one, I'd get rid of the tests that are there. They're just bad. But two, I would actually have people take a course in informal logic that includes an evaluation of formal logic systems, absolutely, but gets into informal logic from the philosophy roots and argumentation theory, because those things have been discussed and examined in depth, and people barely address it. And then, yes, you can get into the cognitive science side of it, absolutely. But unless you think it's siloed, and I'm not convinced that it is, you've got to have it going across the disciplines and then actually have a core course in that and require it. Now, again, those standardized tests aren't going to reveal that. They're trash. Or if you want to say that standardized tests evaluate critical thinking, great. The GRE does it just as well. You could take the stupid ACT, and it's about reasoning in a closed world environment, reasoning the best answer. Well, there's critical thinking. Okay. But in terms of us thinking about it well, either do a core course, or if it's discipline specific, then talk about it within that discipline and actually explicitly, not just, oh, you're going to learn it eventually by having research papers, written papers, blah, 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 blah. And I don't necessarily think this has to be a top-down thing, but the discussions on it are pretty anemic, or the problems that I just described, where it's always a stipulative definition, crops up. Does that kind of answer your question? Aside from giving you more problems?
No, you answered it in both contexts. So that's kind of good progress. I tend to think about it as like a baseline skill, if you've heard of that.
So then it's not the one ring to rule them all.
No, it kind of would be. It goes in there with the skills that help you improve all things. That's where I would put it in my conclusion.
Okay, cool. All right, others. Or have I exhausted you all?
I actually have one more question.
Yeah.
So critical thinking is in the process of like kind of tearing apart an argument and like explaining your side and things like that. is the goal in a critical thinking environment to analyze the person that you're arguing against and then just make them essentially come to your side? And if that's the process, then in many cases, informal and maybe like a social aspect of it is valuable, right? Where I'm like making them laugh or like me a little bit more so they just kind of fall over to what I say.
Sure. Okay. So if you go back to the definitions that I had earlier, the 6 types of dialogues, it would depend on the dialogue that you're in. But for example, I think it is using the evidence that you have. So I think in some ways, yes, but it would depend on the sort of discussion you're in. If a philosophical discussion, usually you say that emotion isn't there. So when you're having the critical discussion, that it wouldn't be. So I got to go talk to book agents a couple weeks ago. And so for them, I was pitching, right? And so then I do have to do what's the interpersonal thing? And because I did it in person as opposed to doing or just send them a query. And in that, certainly I'm thinking of persuasion techniques. There you're running into ideas of rhetoric and social science. And so this is actually a debate, a very fun debate. And so does critical thinking inform how we would use those or how we analyze them? Or does critical thinking, and I think it's Tyndale and whatever, but he thinks that we should start including rhetoric within critical thinking. He actually wants to include it under argumentation theory, which then is a subset. There's a case to be made for it to be there, but in the philosophical sense, I don't want to necessarily know if I want to say the truest sense, it's the idea of evaluating arguments well. That's kind of the core. That'd be a better way of putting it. That's the core of it. And in that sense, you want to not have emotion, that sort of thing. And so you can have it with that interpersonal thing. But in that instance, it's about evaluating. And actually the way that people often will teach it is not that you're trying to persuade the other person, but they're trying not to be duped. That's that at the core. A lot of the books that are published on it and the way it's usually taught is how not to be duped. Yeah.
Or how to lie with statistics.
Exactly. All right. Any follow-up? I know I took forever with my presentation. I do apologize.
You're all good. Thank you so much for coming, Kreigh. That was super interesting. I'm really
my pleasure.
Thank you for your great questions, guys. Remember to share that link with anybody who's interested, and that includes you, Kreigh, if you have people who are interested. And I'll see you next session. Try and write your articles by next session. Next session will be a review session. We'll structure it slightly differently, but I'll email you about that. And wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. It was great.
If anyone has a follow-up question, I guess you can maybe filter it through Rosie, but I'm happy to respond to some. Some of them might be, I may answer, read my book next year. But because it might be too long of a question for me to answer and it'll literally be a book length. But the others, I can at least point you to other resources or whatever capacities you have.
Great. Yeah. So if you have any questions, send them to me and I will forward you Kreigh's email and you guys can ask him. Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. I'll see you guys next week. And thank you very, very much, Kreigh. It's great to have you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great week, guys. Ugh.